Hi, this is Christian Boaz, Sessom, and today we'll be talking about the Yazoo land scandal and how it left its mark on America. A little brief background information before we really dive into it. The Yazoo land scandal is an often overlooked historical event in America's history. It is not part of the normal curriculum that most Americans have to go through during their years of education. However, this land scandal is remarkably important to America's history. America would be drastically different today if the Yazoo land scandal never happened or if it had played out any differently. The Yazoo land scandal goes by many different names in the field of history, but for this presentation we're going to stick with calling it the Yazoo land scandal. The Yazoo land scandal was a massive fraud committed by the state of Georgia. This presentation will show how the Yazoo land scandal is vitally important to American history, and that the scandal changed the United States in numerous ways. And one quick disclaimer before the next slide, there are many different scandalous events that take place around the Yazoo land. But the scandal that actually gives the Yazoo land scandal its name isn't the bribes and political insider land buying that takes place with the Yazoo Act, but it happens when the Georgia governor signs the rescinding act and nullifies the Yazoo Act. This is when the scandal becomes a real scandal. This will make more sense later in the presentation, just remember it as we're going through. The Yazoo land scandal started in 1784 when Georgia first started to try to establish its claimed Yazoo land. Georgia had claims all the way to the Mississippi River. This land included most of the land of modern-day Alabama and Mississippi. Georgia knew they could not defend the Yazoo land without having settlements in it, so they set out to plant some. Most of the people that lived in the Yazoo land were Native Americans at this time. Before the first really scandalous events of the Yazoo land scandal took place in the 1790s, Georgia tried 3 different times in the 1780s to organize settlements in the Yazoo land area. In 1784, the Muscle Shoals area, in 1785, the Bourbon County Act, and in 1789, the Combined Society. They all failed. It took a few years before the Yazoo lands had another real attempt at being settled by the state of Georgia. The Yazoo Act was signed in 1794, and it would change the United States forever. The Yazoo Act signed over the claims of the Yazoo lands to 4 companies that were created for the sole purpose of obtaining the Yazoo lands. They were dubbed the Yazoo Land Companies, and there was 4 of them. The act was signed by Georgia Governor George Matthews. Georgia gave 40 million acres of land to the Yazoo land companies for around $500,000. This was not a clean deal there. There was much bribing of Georgia political officers. They were offered money or stakes in the Yazoo land companies. And even though not all the shady deals of the act were public, the act was still heavily protested by many people in Georgia. Yet it still went through because of how much political backing it had, mostly because of bribes. Quickly after the Yazoo Act, Yazoo companies sold much of the land to third-party buyers for more than they bought it for. Many of these buyers did not know the scandalous and shady nature behind the original land sales. Soon after the signing of the Yazoo Act, the scandalous nature got out to the public. This caused outrage in not only Georgia, but much of the United States, and pleas to politicians in every branch of government to come fix it were made by the people. James Jackson and Jared Irwin came to the rescue for Georgia. Both saw political opportunity in the politically torn state. James Jackson actually even resigned from his Georgia Senate seat to come help. They both helped write the Rescinding Act and signed it into law. Jared Irwin, who became governor, signed it into law even though James Jackson was the leading force behind it. After this, they both worked towards destroying most of the copies of the Yazoo Act. The one that survived was the one that was originally sent to President George Washington. The creating and signing of the Rescinding Act is what made the Yazoo land scandal a true scandal. James Jackson became the governor in 1798, largely because of his role in the Rescinding Act. He even amended the Georgia state constitution to make the Rescinding Act legal. He paid back many of the people that had bought Yazoo lands from the Yazoo companies, but if they did not accept, he would still not recognize their land claims, or let them have a hearing in front of Congress for fear of losing. A few years later, in 1802, the Yazoo lands and who had the legal claims to them were still under great controversy, so Georgia gave up. They decided to surrender all its claims to the Yazoo lands to the federal government, and with it, all the problems that were surrounding it. This sale is known as the Compact of 1802, with much help by Georgia governor, who was now Josiah Tatnall, and Georgia senator, who was the ex-governor James Jackson. They sold the lands for $1,250,000 and a promise from the federal government. The promise was that the federal government would rid Georgia of all Native American land claims. This would come back to bite the federal government. The newly acquired federal land would soon become part of Mississippi, and later much of it would end up becoming part of Alabama as well. Even after the United States federal government got the Yazoo lands, they did not recognize the claims of those who had originally bought the Yazoo lands from the Yazoo land companies. Congress kept refusing pleas and protests from these landowners. Congress did not want to embarrass the already embarrassed Georgia and go against their laws. However, a case involving the two parties that had stake in the Yazoo lands finally made it to the Supreme Court in 1810. The case was titled Fletcher v. Peck. In short, the Supreme Court, who was under the control of Chief Justice John Marshall at the time, ruled that the rescinding act was unconstitutional. The Yazoo land claimants received a combined compensation of $4.5 million. There were other rulings involved in this case, but in regards to the Yazoo land scandal, these were the most important outcomes. The Fletcher v. Peck court case mostly ended the disputes over the Yazoo land with the European-descended Americans and the federal government. This did not resolve all the claims that the Native Americans held in Georgia and the Yazoo lands. And because Georgia was made a promise by the federal government that the federal government would rid Georgia of all Native American land claims, the federal government knew it had to keep its word. Georgia had started to take matters into its own hands via a land lottery system that was giving away Native American claimed land to Georgia residents. So to make good on their promise, the federal government signed into law the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This ended the Yazoo land scandal. Unfortunately, it did not end the repercussions. After this abridged description of the history of the Yazoo land scandal, it should be clear that it left a few main marks on America and its history. It changed the geographic outlay and power balances of the United States of America. It solidified the law that the United States Constitution was superior to state laws, while also helping to determine how the laws behind land sales and contract clauses in America would be interpreted, and it was a leading reason for the horrible happening of the Trail of Tears. The Deep South might look much different if Georgia could have managed the Yazoo lands better. Mississippi might have never become a state. Before Mississippi obtained the Yazoo lands, Mississippi was just a small U.S. territory that did not have any coastal land and had a population smaller than any other state by over 50,000 people. Only after Mississippi got the Yazoo land did their population grow rapidly and they become a state. Alabama might have never become a state as well. It was not even a territory when the Yazoo lands went to the federal government. It got most of its land from the Yazoo lands. If Georgia had hung on to these lands, it's very likely Alabama would never have been created. Georgia potentially could have become a powerhouse state. It could potentially be the size of modern-day Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. It would hypothetically have the third most electoral votes as well as population, thus making it one of the most powerful states in the nation. But because of the Yazoo scandal, we'll never know. The Yazoo land scandal brought Fletcher v. Peck to the Supreme Court, and this is a case that had a few groundbreaking rulings. The Supreme Court ruled that constitutional law is superior to state law. By ruling that Georgia's rescinding act was unconstitutional, it was the first time that the Supreme Court went against the state law. While this was already clear in the Constitution, it was still groundbreaking because it was the first time it had been solidified in court. The Supreme Court also ruled that binding contracts cannot be nullified by a law after the contract is signed. The Supreme Court used this ruling as a guide for future cases of contract law and contract clauses for over 100 years after the case. If not for the Yazoo land scandal, who knows when these rulings would have been made in the Supreme Court, and who knows if the rulings would have been ruled the same. The Yazoo land scandal led to the genocidal happening of the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears came as a result of the Indian Removal Act, which was a result of the Compact of 1802, which was a direct result of the Yazoo land scandal. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law in 1830 by President Andrew Jackson. There was pressure on the federal government by Southerners, especially in Georgia, to keep its promise that came in the Compact of 1802 and nullify the land claims that the Native Americans had in Georgia. Many of the Southerners wanted this because the potential to grow cash crops on the Native American land. Shortly after it was signed, it forced many Native American tribes from their homeland into land west of the Mississippi. This act would tarnish the legacy of Andrew Jackson and the United States of America forever. In total, over 100,000 Native Americans were removed. The tribes of Cherokee, Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Seminoles were involved. It was coined the Trail of Tears because of the wretched effects it had on the Native Americans that were removed. I will stress it again, the Yazoo land scandal is one of the most overlooked events in United States history. If someone looks up Trail of Tears on Amazon Books and reads the entirety of the top 3 books that come up, they will not find one mention of Yazoo within any of these books. And this is just one example of how understudied and underappreciated the Yazoo land scandal is. Why is the Yazoo land scandal not a mainstream historical event like other big historical events that have affected America's history this much? We might never know the answer. But what one can know is that they should take pride in knowing about such an important American historical event that not many people know about. Here's my sources used, and that's a wrap. Thank you for listening.